Wren Ashby was 22 years old when the man at the housing office handed her file back across the counter and told her there was nothing else he could do for her. Her caseworker had retired in March. Her foster placement had ended on her 18th birthday, 4 years and 2 months earlier. The diner where she had worked for the past 2 years closed without warning in August, and the room she had rented above the auto parts store on 12th Street had gone with it. The system that had carried her since she was 4 years old was finished carrying her. To the state, she was an adult, and adults figured it out. She walked out of that office carrying a green canvas duffel that held everything she owned in the world. In the front pocket of her jeans was $8.16, the change from a gas station meal she had bought 3 days earlier and had been stretching ever since. 6 weeks later, the regulars at the Halberton Fairgrounds auction watched her bid every cent of that money on a property the county had given up trying to sell. An abandoned railroad depot on a defunct line, 11 miles from the nearest paved road. Roof half collapsed, platform rotting through. Boarded since 1979. The room laughed when the auctioneer wrote her name in the book. What she found 9 months later inside ticket booth 3, behind a door no one had opened in 54 years, would bring the same banker who had once denied her a $500 emergency loan back up Pine Cut Road with his hat in his hands. $8.16. That was all it took to begin. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Halberton sits in the long, narrow valley where the old Allegheny Spur once carried coal down from the seams above Logan County. The line went under in 1971, and the town outlasted it by more than 50 years, which was longer than most of the people who lived there in 1971 had expected. The high school stayed open. The diner on Main Street changed owners 4 times without ever closing. Marlene Crisp had been sorting the post office boxes by hand since 1986, and at 68 she had no plans to stop, though the regional office reminded her each January that Halberton was on a consolidation list and had been for some time. 2 miles south of town, where Pine Cut Road climbed past Briar Creek and then turned to gravel, the depot stood on a low rise above the place where the tracks had crossed the water. It had been built in 1908. The county had condemned the structure in 1979 after a section of the loading platform collapsed under a high school kid who had been showing off for his friends. The doors were sealed with plywood. A weather notice was nailed to the south wall, listing penalties for trespass that no one had ever enforced. Nothing else happened to it. Tearing it down would have cost more than letting it stand, and the 2.5 acres it sat on were worth so little to so few people that the property moved through 46 years of county records without a single offer. Generations of Halberton kids drove past it without seeing it. The roof was visible from the highway if you knew where to look. Its paint had been gray once. Then it was green. By the time Wren Ashby walked up Pine Cut Road for the first time, it was the color of old paper that had been left out in too many seasons. Inside the main hall, 3 ticket booths still stood against the east wall, though only the older people in town remembered there had ever been 3. The middle one, booth 3, was the one the old men at the diner sometimes mentioned without being asked. A station master named Elias Thorne had worked that booth from 1921 until his death in the summer of 1968, and his replacement had worked it for 3 more years until the line went quiet for good. Anyone who had ever passed through the Halberton Depot had passed through booth 3. Wren had never been to Halberton. The old Allegheny Spur was a name she had never heard, and the depot was a building she could not have picked out of a photograph. On the morning the housing office in Charleston told her that there was nothing else they could do for her, she was 140 miles from Pine Cut Road, sitting on a bench outside a Wendy's on Capitol Street with her duffel bag between her feet, watching a woman across the parking lot scold a child who had dropped a milkshake. In her pocket, she had $8.16. In the duffel were 3 changes of clothes, a paperback whose cover had come away from the spine, a half-empty bottle of generic ibuprofen, and 1 photograph of a woman whose voice she could no longer remember. She had no plan and no one to call. What she had, though she could not have named it that morning, was the particular kind of clear-headedness that comes to a person who has run out of options to weigh against each other. There was nothing left to decide. There was only what came next. She was placed at 4. The home she remembered from before was an apartment with thin yellow curtains and a window unit and a woman who sang to her in the kitchen and one day did not come home. The records said overdose. Wren learned the word much later. In the bureaucratic way information arrived when you were a ward of the state and old enough for the social worker to assume you had pieced it together. 6 placements between the ages of 4 and 12. The houses blurred at the edges the way places blur when you do not stay long enough to learn the names of the streets around them. At 12, she was sent to live with Pauline Halsey, a 61-year-old widow on the east side of Charleston, in a small brick house with a fenced yard and a calico cat named Sergeant. Pauline had been fostering since her own children had grown, and she did not introduce herself the way the orientation pamphlets said she would. She did not make a speech about her home being Wren's home. She showed Wren the room, said dinner was at 6, and went back to the load of laundry she had been folding when the social worker's car pulled up. Wren understood later that this was the most respectful thing Pauline could have done for a 12-year-old who had heard too many speeches already. Pauline kept the same brand of cereal in the cupboard for 6 years. She drove the same Buick LeSabre to the same grocery store every Tuesday afternoon. She put her hand on Wren's shoulder for a moment longer than necessary on the morning of the SATs, and on the morning the biology grade came in, and on no other mornings, because Pauline did not believe in spending what you did not need to spend. Pauline died in the kitchen in February of Wren's senior year. A stroke between the coffee maker and the table. The state moved Wren to another family for the 4 months left until her 18th birthday. And on the morning of that birthday, a different caseworker drove her to a transitional housing program on the other side of town and helped her carry her bags up to the 3rd floor. The 4 years that followed left no record worth keeping. Wren got the job at Polly's Diner on Lee Street within 2 weeks of leaving the program. She rented a room above Henson's Auto Parts on 12th Street with a girl named Tasha who worked the night shift at a call center. She kept a pot hose on the windowsill, grown from a cutting she had taken from a plant in Pauline's kitchen the day before the social worker came to clear the house. The cutting had rooted in a yogurt container of water and grown into something with 7 trailing vines by the time Wren was 20. A community college acceptance letter sat in a manila folder under her mattress. She had been saving for the textbooks at $20 a paycheck, the rest going to rent and the bus pass and the cell phone bill and the groceries. She had not told anyone about the letter. Saying it out loud felt like a way to make it not happen. In June, she had $2,080 in a credit union account. In August, Polly's Diner did not open on a Monday morning. The owner had filed for bankruptcy on the Friday before. A notice was taped to the inside of the glass door. Wren stood on the sidewalk at 6 in the morning with 3 other staff, and they read the notice together and then read it again, and the cook, a man named Frank who had worked there 19 years, said the word that covered it for all of them. They stood there another minute. Then they turned and walked in different directions toward what came next. Tasha moved out in September. She had a sister in Maryland and had been planning the move since spring. Wren could not cover the room alone. She found a job at a second diner that paid less than Polly's. She found another that paid the same and then cut her hours after 3 weeks. The credit union account thinned through October and was empty by the 2nd week of November. She moved her things into a storage unit on Washington Street, paid for with the deposit refund from the room above the auto parts store. She slept at the women's shelter on Courier Street for the first time on November 14th. The shelter let you stay for 30 days. She used 26 of them looking for work. On the morning of the 27th, she was at the housing office, asking the man at the counter what came after the shelter ended. The pot hose was in the storage unit, in a cardboard box, beside Pauline's recipe binder and the photograph and the paperback and 3 changes of clothes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. December was the coldest in 11 years. The shelter at Courier Street kept her 1 extra night and then could not keep her any longer. The woman at the front desk wrote down 2 phone numbers on a slip of paper and apologized for the 3rd time before Wren walked out into the parking lot at 7:30 in the morning. She walked to the bus station first. The terminal stayed open through the night and was warm enough that the people who slept along the benches could sleep without their breath showing. She did not sleep that first day. She sat with her duffel between her feet and read the paperback whose cover had come away from the spine, and at intervals she walked to the bathroom for the sake of moving and then back to the bench. At dusk, a security officer asked her if she had a ticket. She told him she was waiting for someone. He nodded the way men nod when they have heard the same lie 1,000 times and have decided which ones to let go. The public library on Capitol Street opened at 9. She spent 6 hours there the next day. She drank from the water fountain on the second floor twice. She read the front section of the Charleston Gazette-Mail, then the Metro section, then the obituaries, and then she read all of it over again because the warmth of the building was worth the staying. At 4, she walked back to the bus station. At 8, she walked to the 24-hour laundromat on Smith Street, where a woman she did not know had told her on the second night at Courier that you could sit in the back with a book and nobody would say anything if you bought a small box of detergent every other day. That became the shape of the next 19 days. Library, laundromat, bus station, library. She washed her face in public restrooms. She bought one meal a day from the dollar menu and made it stretch through 2 sittings. The pot hose in the storage unit on Washington Street died sometime during the second week. She did not know that yet. She would not find out until February. On the 11th day, she stopped at a gas station to fill her water bottle from the bathroom sink, and the clerk, a tired woman in her 50s with a name tag that read Diane, looked at her and said her name without being asked. "Aunt," she said, "there's a coat in the lost and found. Brown one, navy lining. I'm putting it on the counter for whoever needs it." She did not say it to Wren directly. She said it to the air between them. The coat was on the counter when Wren came out of the bathroom. She wore it for the next 7 months. The auction notice was in a copy of the Logan County Banner that someone had left on the 3rd floor of the library on the morning of the 19th day. It was the kind of small free weekly that piled up unread in the racks outside diners. The notice took up a quarter of page 7. Surplus property disposal. Logan County and Boone County listings combined. Saturday, December 14th, 10 in the morning, Boone County Fairgrounds. She read it once and turned the page. She turned it back 2 paragraphs later. The notice listed 19 parcels. The last one was different from the others. Parcel 19, 2.6 acres with structure, Pine Cut Road, 11 miles east of Holborn. Structure condemned. County Order 1979. Minimum bid none established. Note, property classified as non-recoverable. Subject to as is, where is disposal. Access road unmaintained, seasonal. She read it 3 times. She tore the page out of the paper, folded it once, and put it in the pocket of the brown coat next to the $8.16. She walked the next morning to the bus station and asked the man behind the glass how much it cost to get to Holborn. He looked it up. There was no direct route. The closest a Greyhound stopped was Madison, and from Madison to Holborn was another 18 miles by road. The ticket to Madison was $26. She did not have $26. She had 8. She walked out of the bus station and stood on the sidewalk for a long time in the cold. Then she walked back to the library and looked at a paper map of West Virginia from the reference section and traced the road from Charleston to Holborn with her finger. 74 miles by Route 119 and another 11 up Pine Cut Road from the town itself. She left the next morning before the library opened. She walked the first 14 miles before noon. A man in a Ford pickup with 2 dogs in the bed gave her a ride to Madison and asked her no questions she did not want to answer. A woman driving a Subaru took her the second leg to a junction outside Danville. She slept that night in a barn whose door she had asked permission to use, and the farmer's wife brought her a thermos of coffee at 6 the next morning without speaking and without staying. She walked into Holborn at 3 in the afternoon on Friday, December 13th. The auction was at 10 the next day. The Boone County Fairgrounds were on the southeast edge of Madison, and the surplus auction was held in a low cinder block building behind the livestock barns. Wren walked the 11 miles from Holborn in the dark, leaving the gas station where the night clerk had let her sit by the heater from 2 in the morning until 5. She arrived at the fairgrounds at 9:15 and stood outside the cinder block building for 20 minutes before she went in, because the cold had reached into her hands and she wanted to feel them again before she had to write anything down. The room held about 70 people, farmers in canvas jackets, a few men in suits who had driven up from Charleston, three women near the back who clearly knew each other. A folding table at the front held the bidder registration sheet and a metal cash box. The clerk was a young woman with her hair in a long braid, and she looked at Wren for a fraction of a second longer than was necessary before sliding the bidder card across the table. Number 41. Wren wrote her name and put her ID back in her pocket and walked to a chair near the back wall. The man beside her was 60 or so, in a heavy plaid coat that smelled of wood smoke. He nodded at her once and did not speak again for an hour. The auctioneer was a thin man named Curtis Brackett who handled most of the surplus disposals in this part of the state, and he moved through the first 18 parcels with the economy of someone who had done it 1,000 times. Acreage in Boone County, a condemned single-wide, a right-of-way along an old county road. 2 tax default parcels sold to investors who already knew each other. Wren watched the room. She watched how the regulars held their cards low when they were serious and high when they wanted the auctioneer to see them. She watched the man in the front row who bought 3 parcels in a row and the woman next to him who wrote each price down on a yellow legal pad and underlined the totals. Curtis Brackett reached parcel 19 at 10:53. He looked down at his clipboard, and his face did a small thing she would think about for a long time afterward. It was the face of a man preparing to perform something he had already rehearsed past the point of caring whether it landed. Parcel 19, he said, 2.6 acres on Pine Cut Road, 11 miles east of Halberton. Structure on the property is the old Halberton Junction Depot, condemned by county order in 1979. Property is classified non-recoverable. No minimum bid established. We will open the floor. The room did not laugh. The room did something quieter. 2 of the men in suits looked at each other. The woman with the legal pad set her pen down. The man in the plaid coat beside her exhaled through his nose in a way that contained the entire history of his opinion about the Halberton Depot. Any opening bid? Brackett said. Wren raised the card. Bidder 41, he said. He looked at her then, fully for the first time. What is the bid? $8, she said. Her voice came out smaller than she had intended. She heard it as if from a distance, the way you hear yourself in a recording, and she wished briefly that she had said it louder. The room turned toward her in a slow, accumulating way, the kind of turning that does not require coordination. Curtis Brackett wrote it down. His pen moved without hesitation, which Wren would remember as a kindness. $8, he repeated. Any other bids on parcel 19? A man at the front said something to the man beside him, and they both smiled. The woman with the legal pad shook her head once, not at Wren, but at the parcel itself, the way you shake your head at a problem you have already declined to solve. $8 going once, Brackett said. Going twice. He paused for the regulation second. Sold to bidder 41. Wren walked to the front table. The clerk with the braid counted out the $8 from Wren's hand. Wren had to dig in the lining of the brown coat for the second dollar, which had slipped through a tear in the pocket sometime between Madison and the fairgrounds. The clerk did not comment. She slid the transfer paperwork across the table and pointed to where Wren needed to sign. She handed back a copy of the document, a folded photocopy of a hand-drawn map, and a key. The key was iron. Old, dark, almost black with the kind of patina that takes decades to develop. The bow was a simple oval. The bit was cut deep. It was the heaviest object Wren had held in months. She wrapped her hand around it and felt the weight of it, as if she were testing the truth of something. The man in the plaid coat stopped her on the way out. He did not introduce himself. He looked at her once, looked at the key in her hand, and said, Booth 3. Then he nodded as if he had said all he meant to say. He turned back toward the auction. Wren walked out into the cold parking lot with the key, the map, and 16 cents. She walked back to Halberton along the shoulder of Route 119, and a man in a red Silverado pulled over a mile outside Madison and drove her the rest of the way without asking what she was doing on the road. He let her out at the post office on Main Street at 1 in the afternoon. The light was already starting its slow December tilt toward the ridges. The hand-drawn map showed Pine Cut Road branching south off Highway 3 at the old creamery, then climbing for 2.5 miles before crossing Briar Creek at a small bridge. The depot sat on a rise above the crossing on the east side of the road. She walked it, The asphalt gave out a half-mile in, and the gravel after that was rutted from a recent rain that had frozen overnight and held the shape of the ruts in dirty white seams. She passed 2 trailers set back from the road, a fenced lot with a goat in it, and a brown mailbox with no name and no flag. She saw the depot before she saw the bridge. It stood on the rise the way the map had promised, longer than she had expected, 2-story on the north end where the station master's quarters had been, single-story on the long south end. The roof had collapsed in a section above the freight room. Plywood covered every window on the ground floor. The platform ran the length of the east face and sagged at the south end, where a support post had given out. Honeysuckle had grown across the tracks behind the building and over the iron lampposts that had once lit the platform. 2 of the lampposts were still standing. The third lay in the brush where the platform met the slope down to the creek. She stood at the gate for a long time. The gate was a length of pipe across 2 posts, padlocked, but the chain had rusted through one of its links and the lock no longer held anything. She lifted the pipe off the posts and walked through. Her boots crunched on a layer of frozen weeds. The smell of the place reached her before she reached the doors. Old wood, old creosote, the cold mineral smell of a building that had been sitting through 54 winters without anyone inside it to warm it back. The main entrance was on the west side, facing the road. A double door of heavy oak with a transom above it. The plywood across it was nailed at the corners and at 4 points down each side, but the nails had rusted and one corner was loose. She did not need the key for the front door. She needed it for the smaller door on the south end, which the map had marked as the staff entrance, and which was the door the auction office had told her the iron key fit. It fit. The lock turned with a low, protesting sound, and the door swung inward 6 inches and stopped against something heavy on the floor inside. She pushed harder, and the door gave another foot, and then she stepped through. The main waiting hall opened in front of her. 28 feet wide, 62 feet long, with a vaulted ceiling and exposed timber trusses. The benches were still there, 2 rows of them, dark oak polished smooth by 63 years of passengers and dulled by 54 years of dust. The wainscoting ran 4 feet up the walls. A wood stove stood at the north end, its pipe still rising into the ceiling. A green tin clock above the doorway to the platform had stopped at 4:12. Whether morning or afternoon, she could not tell. She turned slowly, taking the room in. Then she turned to the east wall. 3 ticket booths. They stood side by side, freestanding against the east wall, each one a small, enclosed cabin with a counter at the front, a window of leaded glass, and a numbered plate above the door. 1, 2, 3. The booth on the right, booth 3, was set slightly apart from the other 2, with a narrow space between it and the wall behind it. She did not know yet that there was a door in that space. She did not know yet what the man in the plaid coat had meant. She only knew that her "I went to booth 3 first and stayed there longer than it had any reason to stay," and that something in her chest moved in a way she could not have named. She walked the length of the hall. The floor was solid. The boards were wide pine, 3 different lengths laid in a deliberate pattern she had not seen before, and they did not give under her weight. She touched the counter of booth 1. She touched the counter of booth 2. When she reached booth 3, she did not touch the counter. She stood in front of it and looked through the window. The interior was dark. A wooden chair was visible against the back wall. A mail slot in the back wall, half open. A ceramic mug on the counter, ring of old coffee dried to the bottom. She stepped back. The light was going. She had 4 hours of daylight left, and she had a fire to build before dark, and she had eaten nothing since the half a granola bar in Madison. She began. The first night, she slept on the floor of the station master's quarters at the north end of the building, wrapped in a brown coat and the wool blanket she had pulled from her duffel and a quilt she found folded in a cedar trunk that had been left behind when the building was sealed. The quilt smelled of cedar and thyme and nothing alive. She built a fire in the wood stove with kindling. She broke from the platform railing where the wood had rotted soft enough to snap. She slept 4 hours and woke at 3 and watched the embers in the grate until dawn. On the second day, she walked into Halberton and found the public library and used a computer for the first time in 3 weeks. She made a list. Tarps for the collapsed roof section, roofing nails, a pry bar, a hammer, a bow saw, a bag of rice and a sack of dried beans, and a propane camp stove from the Army Navy on Main Street. The post office was across the street from the library. Marlene Crisp was behind the counter, sorting a tray of mail by zip code, and she looked up when Wren came in and looked at her for a moment that was longer than a glance. And then she said good morning and asked if there was anything she could help with. Wren said no thank you. Marlene watched her walk out and did not say anything else, but she set down the tray of mail and stood at the window for a minute after Wren had crossed the street, and then she went back to her sorting. The work of those first weeks was the kind of work that taught Wren what her body actually was. She had thought she knew. She had bussed tables and stocked shelves and walked 74 miles in 2 days carrying a duffel. She had not known the difference between that kind of tiredness and the tiredness of climbing a ladder for the 11th time on the same afternoon to set the same tarp that the wind kept pulling loose while the temperature dropped, while her hands stopped working in any way she could trust. She tarped the collapsed section of roof above the freight room on the 4th day. She used scrap 2x4s from the platform railing to weight the edges. She nailed the dry corners through the boards beneath. She worked alone and made every mistake a person learning a thing makes, and by the end of the first week the freight room was dry. By the end of the second week, she had cleared the platform of the worst of the fallen debris and had stacked the salvageable lumber under a second tarp at the south end. She had no plan for what she would do with the lumber. She knew only that throwing away wood was the kind of decision a person made later, not now. She slept each night in the station master's quarters and ate from the propane stove and drank water she carried up from Briar Creek and boiled. She had no electricity, no plumbing, no phone signal until she walked the half-mile down to the bend where Pine Cut Road dipped toward the creamery ruins. She walked past Booth 3 every day, sometimes 20 times in a day, and every time she walked past it, she felt the same thing she had felt on the first afternoon. A small attention, a pull her body answered before her mind did. She did not open it for 19 days. She told herself, when she thought about it at all, that there was no point in opening it until she could deal with whatever was inside. She had a roof to finish. She had a chimney to seal. She had 2 windows to reglaze. She told herself this, and she half believed it. The other half knew that she was not yet ready to find out whether the pull she felt was something or nothing. On the 20th day, after the snow that had been forecast for a week finally came and went and left 4 inches that melted in 2 days into a slow, steady drip from every eave in the building, she walked into the main hall in the late afternoon with the bow saw in her hand and stopped in front of Booth 3 the way she had stopped 100 times before. The afternoon light was coming through the south transom and lying across the floor in a long, pale rectangle that touched the bottom of the Booth store. She set the saw down. She tried the door of Booth 3 first. It was not locked. She had assumed it would be. The hinges had rusted into a single dark line, and the door did not move when she pulled it. She fetched the pry bar from the freight room and worked the door at its base. And on the third try it swung inward with a small, reluctant sound and stopped against the wooden chair that had been pushed against it from inside. She moved the chair. She stepped into Booth 3 for the first time. The smell came up around her. Old paper, dry ink, the faintest trace of pipe tobacco that had soaked into the wood 80 years ago and never left. There was a door in the back wall. The door in the back wall of Booth 3 was the same dark oak as the booth itself. Narrow, no wider than her shoulders, with a small brass knob worn smooth by decades of a hand that had reached for it without looking. The keyhole below the knob was empty. The door was not locked. It was only stuck the way a door becomes stuck after 54 years of nothing pressing against it but its own weight. She put her shoulder to it. It gave on the second push. The room beyond was 8 feet by 11, and it had been the station master's back office. She knew this before she had found any of the labels, before she had read any of the papers, because the room told her what it was the way certain rooms do. A roll-top desk against the long wall. A telegraph key on a wooden mount beside the desk, its brass dulled but intact, the wire running up the wall and through a small hole in the ceiling. A wall of mail slots above the desk, each slot labeled in pencil in a careful slanting hand. A coat hook with a wool jacket still on it, the jacket the dark green of railway service, the cuffs frayed where the wearer's wrist had moved against them for a working life. a leather satchel on the floor beside the desk, a pair of reading glasses folded on top of the desk's writing surface, a pipe in a brass holder, a tin of pipe tobacco, the brand and the year both still legible on the label, a cedar cabinet against the back wall, 6 feet tall, 4 feet wide, its doors closed. The room had been sealed for 54 years, and it smelled like a room that had been sealed for 54 years. And Wren stood inside it with her hand still on the door she had just pushed open and understood without yet having any of the words for it that what she had walked into was a life. Not the trace of a life. The actual unfinished work of one. She did not touch anything for a long time. She sat on the floor with her back against the doorframe and looked at the room and let her breathing slow. She thought, in the way thoughts arrive when a person is too tired to push them away, about the day she had walked out of the housing office in Charleston with $8.16. She thought about the man who had said booth 3 and not stayed to explain. When she stood, she went to the desk first. The roll top moved. Inside were ledgers. 2 stacks of them, 11 volumes, each one a year, the years running from 1957 to 1968. The handwriting was the same as the labels on the mail slots. Beside the ledgers was a leather-bound notebook with no year on it, only initials embossed at the bottom right of the cover. E.T. She took the notebook to the floor by the door and opened it. The first entry was dated March 14th, 1922. I have been here a year today. The old man told me at supper that I had earned my keep and that he would put me on the books in the morning. He said it without looking up from his plate. I did not know what to say. I said, "Thank you, sir." And he said, "You are welcome, son," and we ate the rest of the meal without speaking. I am writing this in the room he gave me above the freight office. I am 19 years old. I have nothing in the world but the clothes on the chair and the work he has taught me. I do not know yet that this is enough. He told me at the door tonight that it would be. Wren read the entry twice. Then she sat very still for what was probably a long time. She read on. Elias Thorne had been an orphan from a county home in Pennsylvania. He had ridden a freight car to Halberton in the spring of 1921 because a man at the home had told him there was work on the old Allegheny Spur. The station master who had taken him in was named Harlan Pell. Harlan Pell had been alone 2 decades earlier and had been taken in by the station master before him. The line ran back further than that. Elias wrote about it in an entry from 1929. The Halberton Depot, he wrote, had been a place that took in young people without anywhere to go since the year it was built, and the work of running it had been passed from one such young person to the next for as long as there had been a building on this rise. Wren closed the notebook. She walked out of the back office and through booth 3 and into the main hall and stood for a moment in the pale rectangle of afternoon light on the floor. She walked to the platform door and opened it and stood looking out at the rails that no train had run on in 54 years, and at the slope down to Briar Creek, and at the ridge beyond it that had held its shape since long before any of this. Trust what you know, the notebook had said in a different entry from 1934. Trust your hands. The work will tell you what it needs. She went back inside. She began. Marlene Crisp came up Pine Cut Road on a Saturday in February with a thermos of coffee and a tin of cornbread. She walked through the gate without knocking and stood on the platform until Wren came out. She set the thermos on the bench beside the door. She said the post office had a packet for the depot that had been sitting unclaimed since 1973, and she had finally decided to bring it up herself rather than send it on. She handed Wren a manila envelope. She did not ask any of the questions a person might have asked. She stayed 2 hours. She came back the following Saturday. By April, she had stopped pretending she came up for any reason other than the place itself. Avery Sutton arrived in May. He was 34, a high school history teacher from Logan, and he had heard about the depot from a cousin who had heard about it at the diner. He drove 90 minutes and parked at the gate and walked up the path and asked if he could come inside. Wren said yes. He stayed 3 hours. He looked at the booths and the back office and the cedar cabinet she had begun to inventory, and when he stood to leave, he thanked her and said he would come back. He came back. Word moved the way it always moves in places where people still notice each other. By July, there had been 11 visitors. By September, 26. Some came to ask about a great-uncle who had once worked on the line. Some came because they had read a piece a writer from the Charleston paper had done after one of Marlene's friends mentioned the depot at the grocery store. Some came and did not say why. Lyle Pickering arrived in October. He was 71, a retired state archivist living on a farm outside Madison. Avery Sutton had told him about the cedar cabinet. He drove up on a Thursday and spent 6 hours inside the back office without speaking for the first two of them. He examined the ledgers. He opened the cedar cabinet and looked at what was inside, and when he closed it again, he put his hand against the door for a moment as though steadying himself. The cabinet held undelivered mail. 47 years of letters and small parcels addressed to passengers who never returned to claim them. Soldiers' letters from 1944. A parcel from a mother to a son in Detroit, mailed in 1953. A bundle tied with twine from a woman in Chicago to a railway worker in Halberton. The last letter dated July of 1968, the month Elias Thorne died. Over 400 pieces in all. Elias had kept them, labeled them, filed them by year. The man who worked the booth after him had done the same until the line closed. While Pickering told her, sitting on the bench outside booth 3 in the late afternoon, that the back office was the most complete, unbroken stationmaster's record he had ever seen in the state, and that the cabinet was something he would need to think about for a while before he knew how to describe it. Dean Whitfield came in November for a standard reinspection. He stood in the main hall and turned a slow circle. He examined the roof, the floor, the platform she had reglazed, the staff entrance, the wood stove. He asked her a few questions about the work and listened to the answers. At the door, he said the depot was no longer condemned. Roy Holcomb came 2 weeks later. She was on the platform when his car pulled up to the gate. A silver Lincoln, the only one she had ever seen on Pine Cut Road. He got out and looked up at the depot and stood for a long moment before he started up the path. He recognized her before she recognized him. He had been a loan officer at the credit union in Charleston who had denied her a $500 emergency loan a little over a year earlier. And he remembered her face with the particular discomfort of a man who has been confirmed correct by events he had not wanted to be confirmed by. He delivered his proposal at the gate. He represented an investor group out of Pittsburgh that was interested in the property and the contents of the back office. He named a number. Wren listened to all of it. "Mr. Holcomb," she said, "when I came into your office in Charleston, I had been out of work for 2 months. You told me the credit union could not help me. I understood. I do not hold that against you. What I have here is not for sale. Not the building. Not what is inside it. The people who built this place built it for someone who had nowhere to go. That is what it has been for 117 years. That is what it will keep being." Roy Holcomb looked at her. He nodded once. He drove back down Pine Cut Road, and she watched him go. In the spring, she opened the depot to anyone who wanted to come and look. She kept the back office locked and sat with each visitor who came asking about a name that might be in the cabinet. The first letter she returned was a 1944 V-mail from a corporal named Walter Estep to his mother in Whitesville. His grandniece drove 3 hours to receive it. Wren was 23. She was still learning. She would be learning for the rest of however long she had. Elias Thorne had written, near the end of the notebook, in an entry from 1962, "Where there is somewhere to go, there will be someone who needs it." She had not understood that line the first time she read it. She did now. If you have ever stood somewhere with nothing in your pocket and no one to call, if you have ever wondered whether the place you needed had been built and left waiting for you by someone who walked the same road a century before, this story is for you. Wren did not save a depot. She walked into a house that had been waiting since 1908 for someone with nowhere else to go, and she did the work that came next. Share this with someone who needs to hear that $8 and the willingness to begin is sometimes enough. We are so glad you walked this road with us today. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.